Hey, it's Matt Lansadell, and welcome to the Inspired to Be Authentic YouTube channel. My content is designed for sensitives, empaths, and gay men, but will serve anybody looking to develop and embrace more of their authentic self. So today we are talking about how to break free from codependency and self-abandonment. This video is for you if you find yourself in codependent relationships, you have poor boundaries, you are a chronic people pleaser, or you have an anxious attachment style and you tend to abandon yourself for connection. What you will get from this video, so I'm going to be breaking down some main concepts, helping you understand what codependency is, fear of abandonment, anxious attachment, self-abandonment, and people pleasing. These are all really interconnected concepts, and they all usually are present in a codependent and a self-abandonment dynamic. So I'm going to be breaking down those and giving you guys kind of a clearer understanding of what each of those are. I'm going to be talking openly about my experience with self-abandonment and codependency and how this shows up in my life and what I am doing or have done to break this cycle. Why we abandon ourselves as sensitives and empaths. And lastly, I'm going to be taking you guys through what we can do to stop abandoning ourselves. Okay, so I'm going to be teaching you 7 key areas to focus on so you can break this pattern once and for all. All right, before we begin, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't. You can click on the subscribe button and then hit the bell icon so you get notified when I release content each week. You can follow me on Instagram at Inspired to Be Authentic, where you will find content that you will not find here on my YouTube channel. It's all my written content and some video content that does not get uploaded on YouTube. So please give me a follow over there. The link is in the description below this video. And new to this channel is a Patreon account. So I have added a Patreon where you can support my work. The channel is viewer supported, so if it resonates, please consider sponsoring or supporting my work over on Patreon so I can continue to create high quality content for you to consume. All right, so let's jump in. So what is codependency? Let's start there. So codependency is ultimately a dynamic that we get involved in where we end up lacking a sense of self. All right, so in an ideal, interdependent relationship, you have 2 whole people that come into the connection and they coexist together, but they have separate sense of selves. They have separate lives, they have autonomy, they have sovereignty over their body, their mind, and their spirit. Right? And then what ends up happening in a codependent dynamic is this, right? It's enmeshment. It's loss of individuation or individual sense of self, and we become one. And this is often modeled in a lot of traditional relationships. We see this, and what ends up becoming problematic is if you are somebody who's sensitive or empathic, codependency is a great way to lose your sense of self and to lose your identity and to lose what your needs are, right? So it oftentimes codependency is riddled with this victim and savior dynamic where we have 2 people that are essentially meeting each other's needs while not meeting their own needs. Okay, this is the main problem. It's really wonderful to have somebody meeting your needs in a relationship, but not in place of you meeting your own needs. Okay, that's where we want to focus on. The next term to understand is going to be fear of abandonment. What is fear of abandonment? Well, fear of abandonment is essentially a fear of loss, okay, or a fear of being left. It's directly related to connection, right? So in order for us to feel abandoned, we have to have connection and it has to be taken away, right? Or we at least perceive there to be a connection and then it gets taken away, right? So it could be in reality or it could be in perception, but the effect is still going to be different, or it's still going to be the same. We're still going to experience some form of attachment trauma when we experience some sort of abandonment, okay? Next term to understand is going to be anxious attachment. What is an anxious attachment? So anxious attachment is one of the 4 primary attachment styles. that we develop based off of the experiences that we have as children, right, in our attachment to our caregivers. So there's secure, there is fearful or dismissive avoidant, there is anxious, and there is disorganized, right, which is a fearful or an anxious avoidant blend. So we want to really understand what ours as an anxious attachment would be, that we become quite preoccupied with our relationship. We proximity seek. We want a lot of closeness in our relationship, and we have a hard time handling space. And this shows up because we have a fear of abandonment. That's usually our conscious fear, right? As anxious people, we have a conscious fear of abandonment, and we worry about being left. I find that when you dig a little deeper in this work, and you do this work, you actually realize that there is a strong association with a fear of intimacy with anxious people, because what ends up happening is we attract avoidant people to mirror to us our anxious tendencies and our inability to be with ourselves, right? Which is like self-abandonment. And then what ends up happening is when we do some of this work and we attract somebody who is really whole and they can offer us emotional presence and emotional attunement, it ends up becoming really scary. And we realize that, oh my God, like this is stemming more from a fear of intimacy, because if I have all that I want and then it's taken away from me, right? Like, see how they're blended together. So this fear of abandonment and this fear of intimacy are quite directly connected, because we have to have intimacy in order to experience abandonment. So they go hand in hand. But oftentimes the anxious avoidant, when we're not really aware of our subconscious patterning in this dynamic, we often realize that it's stemming a lot more from a fear of intimacy than it is from our fear of abandonment. Okay, what is self-abandonment? So it's pretty self-explanatory, but I look at it as giving up your connection with yourself for connection with others. Right? This is the core foundation of codependency. It's when we leave ourself, our world, our internal sense of safety, and we try to find that internal sense of safety outside of ourselves, or we try and find that connection outside of ourselves. We try and get our needs met outside of ourselves. Everything becomes focused on other and less on self. This is a pattern we learned in childhood, and I'm going to explain that later in this video. What is people pleasing? So I look at people pleasing as this dysfunctional, maladaptive, can be adaptive. It was adaptive at some point in our life and becomes maladaptive when we're trading in our authenticity for connection, right? So we are becoming who others need us to become in order for us to feel like we are accepted, valued, appreciated, all of these things. So we end up, this is the ultimate way that most of us self-abandon, is we people please, right? We don't lead with our authenticity and with our sense of self. We end up becoming and conforming to what other people want us to be. So they're happy, then we're happy, right? It's a huge reliance on other for happiness and identity. Okay, so now that we've broken down those concepts, I want to share a bit about my experience. So my experience with codependency and self-abandonment essentially started in my young childhood. Looking back, there was a lot of abandonment or perceived abandonment, and then ended up developing a fear of abandonment within my family lineage. Okay, so my ancestral lineage. So I believe that it came from higher up, like within my grandfather or my great-grandfather, where there was some form of attachment trauma, right? Which this is very common, and it's even more common when you have larger families. And I actually, I come from a maternal lineage where my grandfather came from a family of 18 children. So that tells you that how can you meet all of your children's attachment needs when there's 18 of them, right? That's almost impossible. So I feel like for me, my fear of abandonment came from this lineage from my grandfather, and then that was passed down onto my mother, and my mother passed it down onto me. So I kind of mapped it out of how it went for me. So I grew up with a parent with a fear of abandonment, and not feeling like she was loved the way that she needed to be. So that ends up developing, and then, okay, so that's the first part of it. And then the second part of it for me is going to be that I'm highly empathic and sensitive. As we know this, you've seen my videos. So I have an innate skill or quality to be able to tune into other people's emotional world. I think the very first emotional world I tuned into was my mother's emotional world. And I became my mother because I felt that there was some wounding in her and that she needed my love. She needed my support. And I immediately recognized this in her. So the recognition of a parent with a fear of abandonment is going to likely incite this. Then what ended up happening with me is I felt an insecure attachment. I felt like there was some wounding on her part, and then there was this desire for me to want to rescue her. So I developed an insecure attachment from that. I quickly learned to abandon myself to caretake for my mother. And that was the start of my self-abandonment. The start of my codependency is when I left myself to go and tend to somebody that I recognized was hurting, right? So I was misusing my empathy in this case because I didn't have boundaries. I didn't know other ways of functioning, and I felt like this was a way to make myself valuable. It was a way for me to make myself feel better because I have a hard time with other people around me not feeling good, right? When my mother wasn't feeling good and she was hurting around me, it made me feel really uncomfortable. It made me feel sad, made me feel all the things. So I swooped in and tried to change her feelings so I could feel better. Okay, so there's kind of this shadow and light side to empathy, right? We can really misuse it, but we can also use it in a really beautiful way. So without boundaries, it becomes usually shadow. So then you get involved in this dynamic of codependency. So victim savior, okay, right? So I recognized this victim energy in my mom. I came in to save her. I became the main man of the household after my dad left when I was younger. And it was a huge, heavy burden for me to carry on my shoulders. So again, it was this dynamic of me becoming the savior and me not getting my ability to tend to my own needs, right? And this was at a very young age. I learned to abandon my needs to meet the needs of others. So then what ends up happening is my own fear of abandonment gets triggered, right? My own abandonment gets triggered because I'm abandoning myself. So I'm not at home within myself. I'm too busy over here in my mother's energy, and then I get anxious because I don't have groundedness. I don't have a secure sense of self, right? So this leads to a lot of unmet needs, right? How do you meet your needs? How do you understand yourself? How do you develop an authentic sense of self when you're not at home with yourself? Right? So this was a lot of the dysfunction, the dynamic that went on in my life in my early stages that led directly to me developing codependency and self-abandonment. And then what ended up happening was this all transpired throughout all my relationships. Every single relationship I've had in my life up to this point, and I speak of my romantic relationships, have been riddled with me becoming codependent. So usually me taking on the savior role, or once I started to do the deep healing work, I ended up taking on some of the victim role as well. And then that leads to me also abandoning myself, right? So when I'm putting myself out there for other people and I want to make sure that they're happy and that they're pleased with me, that also stemmed from a real strong place of not feeling worthy inside because I hadn't developed my sense of self. How can we have a strong sense of self-worth if we don't have a strong sense of self? Right? So then that's when I abandoned myself even more to try and get them to see me as, worthy. So I do everything for them and I become what they need me to become, right? You see how this is happening? It becomes very, very dark and very spiraled the deeper we go with this. So this is why I'm creating this video to help you understand maybe how this is showing up in your life so you can start putting an end to it and start to find ways of developing a strong sense of self and breaking free of this cycle, okay? So why do sensitives and empaths abandon themselves? All right, so I would say the most primary one is going to be because we are deep feelers, okay? We're deep feelers. We feel other people's emotional worlds. Okay, we feel people's sadness, we feel people's joy, we feel people's hatred, we feel people's jealousy, we feel people's everything, right? And what ends up happening is we recognize in others some sort of discomfort or something, and we swoop in with our cape on and we try and rescue them, we try and save them, we try and make them feel better, right? Because we can't sit with that discomfort of someone else not feeling good, right? So yes, it's a really beautiful skill to be able to people please and make people feel good, right? To caretake for others, but not when we're rescuing them out of feeling their own stuff that they need to feel for their highest evolution, right? That's how I've actually healed a lot of this. I twisted my thinking, I reframed the way I was viewing it, and I looked at it like, well, here I am trying to rescue people out of their feelings so I can feel better, right? There's a little bit of selfishness there because I want to feel better because I can't sit with them feeling bad. That's shadow side of empathy. Then the other side is I genuinely want them to feel better, right? So what I recognized is that my suffering has taught me so much and has been the biggest transformative agent in my life to help me evolve in my consciousness, that when I go in and try and swoop in and change someone's emotional state, I'm literally rescuing them out of potential growth and transformation, right? So I started to use that ammunition to be like, wow, this is one of the ways that I'm going to learn how to develop comfort with other people being uncomfortable, is knowing that they need this, right? We all need what we're calling in for our highest spiritual evolution, right? And I strongly believe that. So that's really helped me kind of back away from wanting to rescue people out of their pain. So that's a big one, okay, that about why we abandon ourselves is because we want to rescue, we want to caretake. It's part of our innate nature. But we need to understand when we're operating out of shadow and when we're operating out of light, right? Can I let this person be in their suffering, right? Or do I need to rescue them because I need to feel better, right? Different way of looking at it. The next one is going to be a lack of sense of self. So growing up, I'm going to say this, we continue to abandon ourselves because we have a lack of development of authentic self. When we first start doing it because we recognize there's some sort of need outside of ourselves that we have to tend to, right? In my case, it was my mother. And then what ends up happening is we continue to do this patterning because we haven't developed a sense of self. Right? So this is where a lot of the healing comes from, which I'll be talking about later in the video, is how we can start to develop our sense of self, and that's going to be a big reason of how we get out of this cycle. The other reasons why sensitives and empaths abandon themselves is going to be we have a large focus on other, right? I believe we're brought onto this planet to heal it. A lot of us are light workers. A lot of us are doing beautiful humanitarian work, right? So we have a strong focus on other. We have a strong focus on humanity, and we want to see the betterment of humanity. So oftentimes selflessness, when not learned the true virtues of selflessness, it can be confused as self-abandonment, right? And I think this is where we need to really get clear on the difference between self-abandonment and selflessness. One is when we're selfless, we are tending to our needs first, right? Because how can I take care of other people's needs if I'm not taking care of myself? So our needs need to be met, then we step into our humanitarian role and we help others. Right? When it becomes self-abandonment is when we are tending to everyone else's needs but not tending to our own. Then what we end up doing is we getting involved in codependent relationships where we expect people to meet our needs when we're not meeting our own needs. And again, that's looking at the shadow side of this type of dynamic. And the last one about why we abandon ourselves is because of trauma. I believe a lot of sensitives and empaths have a lot of attachment trauma because we experience being different. We experience being misunderstood. We experience not feeling heard and seen when we were younger. We experience neglect, abandonment, not getting emotional validation. These are very common things that I see with sensitives and empaths. So this leads to attachment trauma, right? And when we are traumatized, we don't feel safe, right? So what ends up happening is we give our authority away when we don't feel safe, right? Well, and I shouldn't say that. There's two types of ways when we're traumatized and we don't feel safe. We either guard ourselves up, we become calloused, we close down our heart, and we put our walls up, right? Be about giving away our authority, right? So what ends up happening is when we are traumatized, we tend to give away our power, right? We give away our authority to other people and that's how we abandon ourselves, right? We give away our power, we leak it to other people because we don't feel safe, right? And we didn't feel safe in relational dynamics. So we learn to give away our power to other people because then that way we get back some sort of validation, some sort of approval, something. We're getting something in exchange of giving away our power, right? And that's the dysfunction that we learn in these codependent dynamics from our early years. Okay, so that's kind of setting up the stage. Okay, so this is all the dysfunction right here above, and then what I want to start moving into now is what we can do to stop abandoning ourselves. These are the 7 key areas that I think are important to focus on for reclamation of authentic self. That's what I call these seven key areas are all about reclamation of our authentic self, right? Authentic self development didn't happen in our childhoods usually, so we now need to do that work. It's the work of reparenting essentially. So the first one is going to be to grieve our unmet needs. Okay, grief is a very, very big part of the healing journey for sensitives and empaths because we didn't have a lot of our needs met, because we were complex, we were highly sensitive, we had a lot going on, and most of the time our parents didn't know how to tend to us because we were so dynamic, right? So we have to grieve these unmet needs. We have to grieve the fact that we didn't get to develop our sense of self. We have to grieve the fact that we didn't get the type of love and connection and support that we needed, right? We have to actually grieve the loss of our inauthentic self, right? When we first start this work, it's like, okay, I had to develop all these maladaptive things to get by in this world, and now my healing journey begins by deconstructing all of these things, right? These masks, these beliefs, these attitudes, this armor that I've built around me. I got to now deconstruct that, right? So there's a massive grieving process that we go through. And part of that grieving process is also going to be letting go of the conditioning that we inherited from society or our families or our religion that tells us that we're not okay, right? That you're too sensitive, that you feel too much, you're dramatic. All these things that we hear as sensitives and empaths is the stuff that we need to grieve, right? Because we're perfect, we're whole and complete just as we are. We were created this way, right? We have powerful, powerful gifts, and we need to deconstruct some of the ways we view ourselves before we can tap into these gifts. Okay, so grieving your unmet needs, grieving the inauthentic self as it melts away is going to be usually, in my opinion, the first stage, right? Then we need to connect to the victim within us and stop saving others, because as empaths and sensitives, we have a strong propensity to enter codependent relationships where we are the savior, right? We're taking care of the other person and we're tending to their needs, right? And we do this because we learn to abandon ourselves when we're feeling crappy, when we're feeling all the things that everyone else is feeling and we're feeling like we're not getting our needs met. We abandon ourselves, we leave self, and we enter others' world to tend to them, right? And we don't actually be with our victim wounds, right? Which is not feeling understood, not feeling heard, feeling abandoned. That's all stuff that needs to be sat with, right? Because we've been distracting ourselves with our savior roles, right? We've been covering up our victim wounds with our savior role. That's what a lot of us do in these codependent dynamics. So we need to connect to this victim within us, and we need to stop saving others, okay? And that might look like becoming more connected to the victimhood in your life, right? And I know that's a really uncomfortable place for a lot of us because we don't want to be seen as the victim, but we need to move through the things we didn't get to experience when we were younger, and that's part of the reparenting process. So allow yourself to feel victimized, allow yourself to feel the energy of what it was like to be victimized, whether it was conscious or unconscious in your childhood. Allow yourself to be with some of those feelings, okay? Then from that place, I find number three is going to be heal attachment trauma. Okay, attachment trauma is when we have some sort of experience that leads to some sort of trauma, interpersonal trauma, right? Where we have our interpersonal relationship is the foundation or the birthplace of where we started to begin to feel unsafe, or we had some sort of adverse experience within a relationship. That's usually going to be, so oftentimes attachment trauma is really, the research shows that it's really directly related to attachment to caregivers in our early years, right? So did we get modeled consistency? Did we get modeled boundaries? Did we get modeled love? Did we get modeled space? How to have space? These sorts of dynamics in our childhood, right? And if we had a wounded parent that was rooted in abandonment, rooted in fear, rooted in trauma themselves, it's going to likely mean that we inherited that, okay? So attachment trauma, in my opinion, can be inherited as well, because we're going to, it's intergenerational, right? So we need to do the work of healing attachment trauma, and this is I could create 5 videos on how to heal attachment trauma. It's a really big concept and it's beyond the scope of this video, but I will say this. I'll say that attachment trauma, it happens in relationship, okay? And the healing needs to take place in relationship. We need to find safety, we need to find presence, and we need to find emotional attunement with another person, right? Our nervous system needs to feel their nervous system, and we need to come together and we need to have healing that takes place. This can take place in a surrogate relationship, such as a coach or a therapist, or it can happen with a partner, right? You can do this work with a partner. It just takes a lot of diligence, it takes a lot of presence, and it takes a lot of love to do this work. So again, I'll probably be creating more content around attachment trauma, but for there, I'll just leave it there. Inner child work is number 4. So this is a big part of the reparenting process happens in inner child work. So this is when, if you think about the dynamic of self-abandonment, it's essentially abandoning our innocence, abandoning our inner child, right? When we leave self and enter other, we are leaving our inner child, right? And our inner child has developed a mistrust for us, right? It doesn't trust us because we haven't been consistent with ourselves, with meeting our own needs. So when we do inner child work, it's about continuing to show up for yourself with consistency, right? When you have the urges to enter other and abandon yourself, check in with yourself first, right? That's a huge act of consistency and being there to develop trust with your inner child, right? So we need to go in. We need to be with self. We need to grieve. We need to be with the sad and usually really angry. You're going to notice when you do inner child work, there's a lot of anger. Your inner child's very angry at you, and below that anger is hurt and sadness and grief and despair and loneliness, all of these things. So we need to kind of be with those feelings. Those are really important. And then from that place, after we do the inner child work, number 5 is going to be to develop an authentic sense of self. Again, these are developing an authentic sense of self is going to be all about understanding your needs. What do you need to be happy? What do you not need to be happy? What are your likes? What are your dislikes? What are your values? What are your morals? What are your boundaries? All of these things come into play. So a lot of journaling in this space, I find, can be really helpful. Your relationships will be a great area for you to focus on to develop your authentic sense of self, because relationships are going to constantly be mirroring back to us who we are and what we want. So yes, development of authentic sense of self is going to be important. Then once we've developed our authentic sense of self, we can move on to number 6, which is setting boundaries. Okay. When we set boundaries, that's the way we stop abandoning ourselves. We set boundaries. We set personal boundaries with ourselves. So I'm going to spend so much time within myself, then I'm going to go to my partner, right? That's a personal boundary. A relational boundary is going to be, I'm going to tell my partner that I have this personal boundary, and I've set the boundary with him, and he knows now that this is my boundary, right? So personal and relational boundaries are really, really important in this work, and we can only set boundaries when we develop our authentic sense of self, because if we don't know what we want and what we need and all these sorts of things, then we can't set boundaries. right? And I find that when we develop our authentic sense of self, we develop a strong sense of worthiness to go along with it, and that's how we end up setting boundaries and maintaining them, right? Because anybody can set a boundary, but can you reinforce it? But can you reinforce consequences if somebody crosses your boundary? This is all stuff that really comes into the realm of worthiness, which is the last one. So number 7 is going to be to reestablish our sense of worthiness. Okay, and I don't say develop sense of worthiness, and that's very, very deliberate, because we are reestablishing it. We came into this life and we felt worthy, we felt perfect, we felt whole, and we felt complete in this life, and it was our conditioning that taught us that we're not. So and that's in our ego structure thinks we're not worthy. Our heart and our soul knows we're worthy. So we're reestablishing or remembering our sense of worthiness by tuning into ourselves in a really loving and beautiful way, right? You are worthy by design, right? It's your birthright to be worthy. So this is something that we just need to tap into. And I find that the previous 6 steps, the 7th step is not really something we do. It's something that organically happens because those previous 6 steps occurred, right? So it's almost like step 7 is like the gift you're given when you do the previous 6 steps. And this is kind of what I'm starting to taste in my life right now, is I've done such deep work and I've done a lot of healing in these areas. I'm still working with some of the boundary stuff and my development of my authentic self, but I'm starting to get little tastes of each. And I also want to preface by saying here, like, that it's not about each step you have to go through each step perfectly, and that it's going to be linear like that, because they might be in a different order for you. You might go through one at the same time as you're going through another. You might go back into one. This is your own healing journey. It's very unique and special to you, right? And that's why when I create this content, this is really, I speak from a lot of my own experience and experience that I have with clients. So again, make this process unique to yourself and have fun along the way, okay? So now I want to hear from you. I want you to share in the comments below, in what ways are you abandoning yourself? How does this show up for you in your life? And where did you learn this pattern from? Yeah, because I think this is going to be really key. I want you to do maybe some journaling around this as well, like looking at where did you learn this pattern from, because it's going to start to show you like, holy crap, this is how the pattern is staying reinforced, because I wasn't quite aware that it actually came from this place, and maybe it's part of a lineage like it was for me or whatever. And once you know that, it's going to really help with that. So in what ways are you abandoning yourself, and where did you learn this pattern from? All right, thanks for tuning into this video, and I look forward to creating more content for you guys. Ciao.